Unless you're a mad keen golf fan, I'm guessing you haven't heard of Jose Luis Ballester. I certainly hadn't heard of him before this week's Masters at Augusta, but apparently he's the current US amateur champion from Spain. He's become famous for his exploits at this week's Masters, not for his golf, sadly, but for his breaking the rules of etiquette at Augusta. The first was minor. His caddy got kicked off the practice ground for daring to come wearing shorts rather than approved apparel. That was a minor breach of etiquette. The second was more major. Although there are toilets for the players all round the course, not least because the rounds can last 6 hours, Ballester forgot that. On the 13th, during a long round, he suddenly felt the call of nature. While his partner, Justin Thomas, was taking a long while over his putt on the green, Ballester thought it would be okay to relieve himself quietly into the famous Rays Creek on the course. He somehow thought that nobody was going to notice one of the most televised events in the world. As he said afterwards, then I'm like, I really need to pee. I didn't really know where to go, and since JT had an issue on the green, I'm like, I'm just going to sneak here in the river, and probably people would not see me that much, and then they clapped for me. In the most manufactured, image-obsessed golf tournament in the whole world, this might turn out, sadly, to be the highlight of Ballester's career, peeing on global television in the Masters. To say that the club were not chuffed would be a considerable understatement. It was an extraordinary breach of etiquette, and he was thoroughly unrepentant afterwards. Unless his world ranking as a pro becomes so high that the Masters will be forced to have him back, it's pretty unlikely he'll ever get an invitation again. I wonder what's the biggest etiquette fail in your life? A time when you completely misjudged the moment. I remember in Edgware getting my first 2 meetings with other ministers completely wrong. I went to my first minister's fraternal wearing a dog collar, only to find I was the only one there wearing one. So I went to my first chapter meeting not wearing one, only to be then the only one not wearing one, and when everyone else was black from head to toe. I remember another epic fail in St. Paul's Cathedral, supporting someone being licensed as a lay minister. After standing next to Richard as he was licensed by the bishop, Richard then turned the wrong way. If you can imagine, we're in the crossing of that massive cathedral. There's a huge circle where all of this happens. What happened there as he turned the wrong way is we then processed more than 100 meters back to our chair, rather than the 5 meters we would have taken had Richard gone the right way. Everyone looked on in bemusement. It took a long time. You can't imagine how long it takes to process 100 meters slowly with the whole world watching. Epic etiquette fail. Whatever else Jesus is doing here, we must understand that he is upending every expectation about etiquette, about right behavior that the disciples had. We cannot understand the radical nature of what Jesus does here without appreciating how utterly shocking it was. I'm not at all saying that his actions were as thoroughly uncouth as those of Ballester at the Masters. Jesus was making a deliberate point, utterly rooted in grace and humility. They weren't an epic, tactless etiquette fail, but they were just as shocking to the disciples. First point is about Jesus' utter assurance. Utter assurance. It's hard to come to familiar passages like this fresh enough to see them as they really are. I'd often regarded verses 1 to 3 as no more than John giving context, but I was really struck by the emphasis twice on knowing in those verses. In the original language, the same participle knowing is repeated in verse 1 and verse 3. John's pointing out, I think, that these actions that Jesus takes come out of his utter assurance about his identity, his utter assurance about his mission. Jesus takes these scandalous actions, verse 1 tells us, knowing that the hour has come. The hour has come both for him to leave the world and go to the Father. So the sense is that he does what he is about to do, knowing his utter assurance in relationship to his Father God and loving his own in the world. That, John insists, enables Jesus to love them to the end. The second knowing comes in verse 3. Jesus takes these scandalous actions knowing that the Father had put all things under his power. He had put all things under his power, and this is what Jesus chooses to do with that. Also, presumably knowing that Judas was already having it in mind to betray him. It's Jesus' utter assurance in who he is and his mission that gives him the right and the freedom to do as he does. There is nothing and no one who can tempt him from the path of obedience, even if that obedience is going to be scandalous and controversial. Second point, Jesus' disruptive example. Jesus' disruptive example. You may well know the layout of the supper, but it was not at all like Da Vinci's famous painting of the Last Supper. If you were a guest at such a celebration, you lay on a low bench, reclining at the table, eating with your right hand and supporting yourself on your left. Primitive sanitation meant that you habitually ate with your right hand and, let's say, dealt with the consequences with your left. Everyone is arrayed around a central table. Imagine it like spokes around the hub of a wheel. The one reclining at Jesus' breast, as verse 28 has it, wasn't someone enjoying a cuddle with him. It's just the one reclining in front of him rather than at his back. The meal, we're told by John, is well underway. Verse 2 tells us that the evening meal was in progress. So Jesus acts in a deliberately disruptive way. If there was ever a time to do as he chooses to do here, it was surely before the meal began, surely as the guests arrived, not long after the meal has begun. So this is deliberately disruptive. Knowing who he is, John tells us, knowing what his mission is, knowing that he's about to be betrayed, knowing that suffering and death for him is as assured as is his destination, loving his own who's put their faith in him, Jesus rises from the table to do this. I guess conversation might have been a bit subdued anyway. They were facing both feverish excitement and determined opposition. But as Jesus rises, I think, silence falls. What now? What is Jesus about to do or say, I think, is what they're all thinking. They watch him as he takes off his outer clothing and then wraps a towel around his waist. They have no idea what he is doing. Probably they exchanged puzzled glances. They watch him as he pours water into a basin. They still have no idea what this means. And then they watch in simple, horrified, breathtaking astonishment as he kneels before the first of them. They would have removed their sandals as they came in. Feet were such a nightmare. Jesus starts to wash the first disciples' feet, and I think you can hear a pin drop. There is utter silence, aside from slight sloshes of water as Jesus takes water from the bowl, and then the sound of the toweling of the first disciples' feet. No one does this. A wealthy family might provide a slave to do this for very honored guests. But if you look at Luke 7:44, where Jesus is describing his poor treatment of the house of Simon the Pharisee, the usual practice would to be provide water so that an honored guest might wash their own feet. No one does this for another, not even for an equal or an honored guest, and absolutely beyond absolutely never for an inferior. Feet before socks and regular bathing, walking around in dusty conditions, dry conditions, hot conditions were quite simply a stinking nightmare. Their feet were on the outside of the circle as they dined to keep them as far away from the food as possible. If honestly feet were detachable, they'd be even further away. Now you might do this for your children, but better to teach them as soon as you can to do it for themselves. For this is the most menial of tasks. It is seen as demeaning by everyone in the room. Jesus is seen as demeaning himself by everyone in the room. That's what the disciples are thinking. Now, they may have hated what Mary did when she anointed Jesus, pouring out a pint of pure nard on his feet, filling the whole house with its fragrance. Certainly some of them, if not most of them, were offended by it. Mark 14 tells us that they were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor," and they rebuked her harshly. Now, they might have hated Mary anointing Jesus' feet and wiping his feet with her hair, but they could have understood that. At least it would have looked to them like the right way round. From a disciple to her Lord, from a servant to a master, from the one without power to the one with authority. They have no map for this. This is mind-boggling. It subverts every single understanding of authority and power that they have. No one does this for anyone else. To do so will be to recognize the other's massive superiority. This is the task of the most menial of slaves and seen as demeaning even for them. Maybe it's disruptive in another way. The Passover meal remembers the night when the final judgment came on Egypt. The blood of the lambs that the Israelites slaughtered was daubed on the doorposts, meaning that the angel bringing death passed over them for judgment. It's their remembering of that which is disrupted also in this way, as well as by remembering through bread and wine. That first Exodus was a rescue through the exercise of God's almighty power. But this is to be a rescue through powerlessness, through embracing the judgment that we all deserved. We cannot wash ourselves. Jesus, therefore, will kneel before us and wash our feet. Do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. Do for us through humble service, through embracing the powerlessness of the cross. Do for us through providing the sacrifice we needed that we could not give without our own death. This action disrupts even what his disciples knew about God's rescue, that it comes not at the cost of God's enemies, but the cost of God's Son himself. A rescue not through judgment, as was the first Exodus, but a rescue from judgment. Even as they meet to remember the Passover and the Exodus, Jesus' actions deliberately disrupt that remembering. He shows a radical different way, even to the way that God had acted in the past. Third point, Jesus' handling of power. Jesus' handling of power. It's not the having of power that matters. It's what you choose to do with it that matters. A writer in the Victorian period called Lord Acton talked about power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's not what we see here. If Jesus had asked them to wash his feet, they would at least have understood. They might have been offended by his command, but they would recognize maybe that he had the right to ask it. That would have been in the same world as Mary's anointing Jesus. But this they simply have no map for. They are bewildered by what's happening. Jesus continues to work round the circle, kneeling at each disciple in turn, washing their feet and drying them with a towel. There is silence in the room, I think. It takes time. Nobody dares say a word. Maybe it felt like a holy moment. Nobody dares look at one another. Maybe everyone hopes that someone else will say something, might object in some way. But even so, the tension is building, I think. We're not told how many feet Jesus has washed before he gets to Peter. I'm guessing that maybe Peter was close to him at the table. Verses 23 and 24, which we haven't had read, suggests that Peter spoke to John, who was close to Jesus at the table. So maybe Jesus has gone around most of the disciples. But in verse 6, he finally comes to Simon Peter and kneels at his feet. And Peter objects. Lord, are you going to wash my feet? What's he saying? He's saying, I think, you are my master. You are the Messiah. You're the anointed one. How on earth can you do this? If word gets out that you've done this, your authority and reputation will be trashed in a second. You'll be a laughingstock. Jesus replies that while Peter doesn't understand what this means now, he will come to understand. But Peter says firmly and emphatically, no, you shall never wash my feet. Literally, by no means shall you wash my feet unto the age, which we could translate as, not until hell freezes over will I let you do this. When President Trump first came to power the first time round, many Americans were so horrified that they wore T-shirts that said, not my president, or not in my name. Didn't show a lot of grasp of how nations actually work. But I think that's sort of what Peter is saying here. Not my Messiah. My Messiah doesn't do this. My King doesn't do this. This cannot be what being the Messiah means. I also wonder if Jesus' example here is what finally pushes Judas over the edge into a betrayal that might force Jesus into being a different Messiah than he's showing them this evening. Jesus' reply to Peter is simple. Again, looking forward to the cross. Unless I wash you, you have no part in me, where the word part means no share, no inheritance in me. I wonder if then Peter throws up his hands in horror. He is not at all happy with this. He is not down with this at all and says, well, basically, wash the whole of me then. Maybe that breaks the tension. Maybe it makes Jesus smile. Jesus says that's not necessary, for he will be washing them all clean. Again, looking forward to the cross. After washing Peter's feet, Jesus finishes the task. We're told in verse 12 that he went round and washed all their feet, including, of course, those of Judas. Having returned the bowl and the towel, Jesus again puts on his outer clothing and returns once more to join them, reclining at the table. He challenges them to grasp what he's done for them. Rightly, Jesus says they call him Lord and Teacher, but no student, he insists, is greater than his master. No messenger greater than the one who sent him. I have done this for you. As my disciples and messengers, you are not greater than I am. So if I am willing to do this for you, you must be willing to do this for others, even to do this for one another. As he says later in verses 34 and 35, after the meal has finished, he says, this is my command, a new command, to love one another in this same humble, servant-hearted way, to show the world a different way, a way based on loving service rather than assertive power. And he promises them, doing ministry this way together, Doing mission and evangelism this way together will show others that I am present in and through you. And verse 17 invites them, now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. What does this mean for us today? It invites us first to grow in intimacy with the Father. To grow in intimacy with the Father. Jesus' humility is rooted in his identity. He is so secure in his assurance of who he is in the Father that he is able to set this scandalously disruptive example. As he completely knows who he is, as he is utterly assured of what the Father thinks of him, he can never be demeaned by such humble service. Because his identity is secure, he can serve to the uttermost. And it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks of him, because he has that utter assurance in the Father. I wonder where we might lack that assurance. Because we're called into that intimacy with God ourselves. The Father wants us to know him like that. And often, I think, in faith terms, boldness flows from intimacy. When we know what the Lord is asking of us, then we have a simple choice. It's the not knowing that often paralyzes us. Just think of these passages with me. Ephesians 3:12. We're told in Jesus and through faith in him, we may approach God with freedom and confidence. That's an invitation to intimacy. That's a child running and leaping into their parents' lap. Because Jesus is our high priest, we're told, we should approach God's throne of grace with confidence in Hebrews 4:15 and 16. Approach the throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Again, Romans 8:15 and 16. The Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship, and by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. We're invited to that kind of intimacy with God. And when we have that kind of intimacy with God, when we can cry out, Abba, Father, and know that we are loved and that we love in turn, then we can live for God with utter assurance. What steps do we need to take towards knowing the Father as intimately as we can? And what bold steps in faith might flow out of knowing that intimacy with God? Challenge the second. How do our relationships show the Lord's presence to others? How do our relationships show the Lord's presence to others? As he said in verse 35, our relationships would show that he was present in us. Now, there are all kinds of ways in which I think we do this and do it well, whether it's in small groups or in meal trains or faithful prayer for others and faithful service in open house and pastoral teams. There are all kinds of ways in which we do this well, and it's often amazing. It really is. But are there other ways in which we don't show the Lord's presence to others? When we fight about worship sometimes, when we talk about other people behind their backs, talk them down, rubbish them sometimes. When we want what we want and we won't compromise often. When we're critical sometimes. And that's just within the local church, without even touching church politics in the nation as a whole. In all these ways, we don't always manage to love one another as Jesus loved us. At worst, I'm not sure that we even try. Where might we need to forgive? Where might we need to take the initiative in making peace? Remember, he washed Judas's feet. Not just those who loved him, not just those who are going to serve him for their whole lives. He washed Judas's feet 24 hours or less before he betrayed him. How can we refuse to forgive and to make peace in his name when we follow one who would even wash his betrayer's feet. Romans 12, I think it's 18, says, if it is possible, insofar as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. How might Jesus challenge us to do a better job in showing his presence to others in the way we relate to one another? And it challenged us, third, what holds us back from humble service? What holds us back from humble service? Yes, we should serve in accordance with our gifts. Yes, we should do what we do best for the Lord, but not if that means we cannot and will not serve humbly. Are there tasks which we think beneath us? Are there people whom we think aren't worth our attention and our care? Are there tasks for which we will not find time simply because they don't feel important enough to us? And if this example of Jesus is shocking to us, if we recoil from it, then it might be time to kneel before the Lord and ask for his forgiveness and to ask him to break in us whatever it is that holds us back from humble service. Will we be faithful to Jesus and his example in how we handle the power that he entrusts to us? Never has the challenge to be Christ-like seemed more enormous than it does in this passage. The only place we can rise to that is on our knees.